some of the sonic hallmarks of that album are things that Jimmy Page is somewhat directly responsible for, like the sound of John Bonham's drum kit. Now, if you compare Led Zeppelin 1 to every other hard rock album that was coming out around that time, you will notice that the drums sound completely different on Zeppelin 1 than they do on any Who album or any Sabbath album or any Purple album or any other, Cream album or anything like that. All of a sudden, drums sound big. And that's Jimmy Page knowing how to get drum sounds in the studio. Plus, add in John Bonham, whose sound was already big. All right? But a lot of the times, if you listen to, Stones albums, Beatles albums, things that were, of the 60s, the drums didn't sound big in those days. They sounded kind of like cardboard boxes comparatively.
Sounds all of a flat, sudden,
Yeah, the first thing you get on Zeppelin 1 is Good Times, Bad Times, where John Bonham is giving a clinic on kick drum magic, where his foot is just doing these triplets and shit that is just insane. And you hear every thump, and it hits you with force coming through your speakers when you hear it. It's like you're actually seeing real drums as opposed to hearing some facsimile of drums recorded on an album. This is the first time drums sound big, really, on this album. And that's, again, that's due to Jimmy knowing how to get that sound and John Bonham already, getting a good sound out of his kit.
And it holds up too.
It does. And, a lot of that kind of thing has been sampled over the years by a lot of artists. John Bonham's drums have probably been sampled more than any other drummer's stuff has ever been sampled and used in all kinds of music, and I think rightfully so. And it's still, and they would get better with the subsequent. I think the Sonics would get better with the subsequent albums, but even that first album has this as a baseline of like a new benchmark of, this is sonically different sounding than any other album that was out at that time. And the guys like the guys from Cream were like super jealous, and they couldn't acknowledge that it was good and stuff like that. And guys like Ritchie Blackmore were paying attention and seeing what could be achieved if you went in a hard rock direction as opposed to a psychedelic rock direction. And
what did he do specifically to make those drums sound so massive?
So prior to that time, they would have the drums in the studios be like boothed off, like with baffles around them, so that like they could control the sound, and they would mic them up and everything. But what Jimmy did was he would get them in a big sounding room that had a nice ambience to it and a nice echo to it. And when you play drums in a room that sounds good, when you play any instrument in a room that sounds good acoustically, what happens is, you get this lovely reverberation, this ambience in the room. And what Jimmy did was he would distance mic the drums, so he would get the room sound in addition to the close mic sound of the drums. In those days, we're not talking about even 24 track yet. So a lot of the times you'd have like two overhead mics and maybe a mic on your kick and maybe a mic on your snare or something like that. And Jimmy's whole thing with miking technique, and he would do this with the guitars too, was in those days, you would get, his thing was find a good sounding room and then capture the sound of it. Like I said, you would capture the sound of having like a room mic that's just picking up the ambience in the room when the instrument's being played. And then you add that in on top of the sound of the close mics. You blend it in so that you get however much ambience or reverb, if you will, that you want on this drum kit. So instead of them sounding like dry cardboard boxes, they would breathe, right? There'd be this depth to them. His thing was distance makes depth. So we don't really record that way very much anymore. But I mean, when we talk about, the iconic drum sounds like When the Levee Breaks, which came later, right, on the fourth album. It is the probably quintessential drum track of all time for drum sound. And the way they got that, there's a whole video, by the way, of other drummers like Chad Smith and Roger Taylor and I can't remember who else. They went back to Headley Grange where they recorded this, which was a manor in the English countryside. And it had this big open hallway when you walked in. It was 2 floors up. So you had this big open foyer. And they were going to Zeppelin was set to record there. And someone came in and set up John Bonham's drums right in the foyer. And John Bonham came in and sat down at his kit. He didn't bother moving him into a room or anything. And he started playing it in this big room, which was like, 2 floors high. And the sound was just massive. And all they really had to do was hang 2 microphones over the drum kit to get that sound because the room sounded so good. So Jimmy got these drums out of these dead sounding rooms, put them in live sounding rooms, and then captured the sound of the room. And all of a sudden, drums sounded like drums the way you hear them if you're actually in a room with a real kit. And, again, that was something he would have done with any drummer, I think. But the fact that he had John Bonham, it just made it that much more powerful.
Yeah, you can't overstate enough what a monster John Bonham was.
No, you really can't. And, I know this is about Jimmy, but it's hard to talk about these things without talking about the other members of the band and how important it was to the overall sonic and the vision. These were all very talented musicians, right? Everybody in this band became a template for what hard rock and heavy rock should sound like. Before Led Zeppelin, you didn't have this template. Now this is what a rock and roll badass guitar player should look like, other than Keith Richards, but like a lead player. This is what your lead singer should look like. He should be a golden god with pipes for days. Your drummer should be a Ferrari engine, and your bass player should be able to do everything, and this became sort of the template for all hard rock and heavy metal that ever followed. It was, your singer had to be this guy with the big range and this powerful voice, and your guitar player had to be a really, really good rhythm and lead player, and your drummer had to be big sounding, and your bass player had to have his own thing that he added to it too. So the thing is, though, as talented as these guys were, Plant and Bonham, especially being so young at the time, it was Jimmy Page's vision that really let them become how magnificent they were in terms of, would they have had the opportunity to sound like the Robert Plant and the John Bonham we know if they had never met Jimmy Page? I don't know.
Right.
I think their talent was there, but I think the guidance came from Jimmy and the vision of this is how we're going to present this music.
I think super groups are a good testament to that. Like, it always sounds great on paper, but in practice it doesn't always work that well. When you just if you get 4 really talented musicians together, it doesn't always turn into magic.
Led Zeppelin, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it can happen a lot of different ways. And, band chemistry and all, they became very much about the difference between live and studio was sort of picking up where Cream left off. Not quite as indulgent as Cream, but they would go off on these long jams too. And that's where they themselves enjoyed the band the most, because Jimmy would tell you, we'd get on stage every night and we knew which songs we were going to play, but we never knew how we were going to play them. Yes, we'd play Whole Lotta Love, but was it going to be 18 minutes long or was it going to be 40 minutes long? We didn't know when we started. If we'd go on a groove and we'd just take off and start doing all different kinds of things, and they could all follow each other, and they all had such chemistry after a while that it was really fairly seamless. They would watch each other and they would go off into different directions, and you see there's examples we can show you here of them jamming out other songs during the middle of Whole Lotta Love and things like that, and they just go on these adventures. And for them as players, that was what they found the most satisfying part. I mean, they've often asked Jimmy which he liked better, the studio or the live, and he won't really commit. He said, I guess the player in me really loved that jam aspect of it and being the freedom to be able to do that kind of thing. He said, but I also love the studio, and I also love to be able to create this sonic architecture of what I want to hear on a record. And that is really a rare kind of thing. And it was even rare then. I mean, but the further and further we get away from that kind of music, you don't see that kind of jamming a lot in most bands these days. So it became very self-indulgent in its time, and people kind of grew tired of it over the decades, and things tightened up and everything. And by the time they do, for example, their last gig in 2007 called Celebration Day, when they finally reunited after a long time, and it was actually really good. One of the things they didn't do was a lot of this jamming. They just sort of played the songs, kind of the way they were on the album. And in that era, I think that was probably the smart move. But back in the 60s, when there was all this experimentation going on, people wanted to see them stretch out. People wanted to see them stretch out their musicianship. And that's why bands like Cream and Hendrix and Zeppelin would do that. The Who would do it too, by the way.
They played shows that were like 6 hours and stuff, right?
More like 3 or 4, I think, at the top of the thing. Yeah, I think the ones that I think we hear about most are like the Boston Tea Party gigs that were, they played everything they knew, and the band still think they still wanted them to stay on stage. So they jammed stuff, and they played maybe like 4 hours or something like that. And then, later on, as they had more material and they got more into the acoustic, they would play a 3.5 hour set with a little break, and they did like a 1 hour acoustic set in the middle of the night. Wow. So they come out with electrics and they blast for a while. Then they take 15-minute break, come out with acoustics and do all of the acoustic stuff that they wanted to do. And then they'd go back and put the electrics back on and come back out and blast again and for the finish. And, I mean, you can see this in the Earl's Court footage. It's really, it's still a benchmark. I mean, mistakes and all, there's mistakes in it and stuff. But, I mean, it's still incredibly powerful. And they were incredibly powerful live. And one of the things that struck me is that when I did go see the 2007 Celebration Day thing, you can buy it on DVD, but I first saw it in the theater when it was being shown in theaters. I was really pleasantly surprised at how amazing they still sounded. And this was like Zeppelin on maybe, 5 cylinders compared to what they were in their prime. And they still sounded fucking amazing. And the sound was great. And this was with Jason Bonham on drums and instead of John. And Robert Plant's voice is, nowhere near as high as it once was. And yeah, they fixed up some stuff in the studio. They absolutely, patched up some of the live footage and stuff with doctoring the sound and all of that, where, maybe if Robert Plant sang a flat note, he'd go in and fix it or something. But the sound of the band was still really, really powerful. And the sound of Jimmy Page's guitars was still really epically big. In some cases, his sound was even better because I think, he had, was using better, not necessarily better gear, but I mean, you maybe just hearing it better.
Recording gear was probably better.
Yeah.
And I think they also tuned down a little bit to accommodate
Robert's voice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But on Nobody's Fault But Mine, when he hits that chord in that concert, that sounds just like, that sounds so huge.
Yeah, his guitar sound was
it's unbelievable.
Yeah, his guitar sound on that was just epically big. And of course, he's standing there now, and that at that time, a gray-haired man, finally clean and all of that, and playing well. And there weren't too many terrible moments in that. There were a couple of train wrecks, but overall, it was like you could still catch a glimpse of the mighty Zeppelin there. And like I said, it's not like the 8-cylinder Zeppelin that you saw in 1973 to 75, but Zeppelin on 5 cylinders or 6 cylinders is still better than most bands.
Yeah. That album, How the West Was Won, with maybe we're skipping ahead a little bit here, but that also just sounds the album sounds great.
That's them in their prime. Yeah.
But that live they just sound like just so big, so loud.
Yeah.